So today we're going to talk about the prospect of Amtrak in Georgia. We're going to go over some overviews here. We're going to be going partially over the 2035 plan. At least that's going to be the basic structure, since it's a very underwhelming phase one, and we'll get more into that as on a route by route basis. Corridor ID is the 15% smaller version that we went with because thank you Congress and the federal government. Also, very briefly, we're not going to mention the long distance routes too much. Originally, this was going to be two presentations, two different videos. That got stitched into one, and stitching it into one made it so that the long distance routes don't really need to be talked about, or if they do, it's a little bit more less, or a little bit more zoomed out from Georgia. So I'm just not talking about it in this video. It's just too much for one video, and this is probably going to take me at least an hour to record. So we're just moving on. So the background is mentioned. This was Amtrak's proposed Atlanta hub. The brief explanation of the map, because it's going to be on the schematic one I made, it's going to be very similar. Green stations are the ones that Amtrak wanted to add. White ones are ones that already exist. On my schematic map, they're black. I also added a few light blue ones in for stops that I think should exist along the route, just for the sake of adding more coverage to the system. Basic outline of Amtrak service was 3 trains daily to Charlotte, 3 daily to Savannah, 2 daily to Nashville, 3 daily to Montgomery, and then 1 daily to Birmingham. We'll get into all of these various basic routes in a minute. This is the corridor ID map. All the little dashed lines are the lines that are being studied. They were given money from the federal government in 2022. Basically, we're getting all these routes looked into, also the route to Nashville and to Memphis is one contiguous route, at least as far as planning's going. And then this, if I ever wanted to do it, and I'm probably going to with the Central Georgia video, this is going to get its own little blurb, so I'm not really going to talk too much in detail right now, especially considering I think today's the last day, at least the day I'm recording. This is the last day or the second to last day of one of the rounds of surveys on this line. So we're just kind of leaving it there, because I'm very timely at making these. This is the long distance network and the relative capacity of the system, or at least the relative used capacity of the system. The Atlanta-Charlotte segment, even though it's a partially overnight route, is fairly well patronized in coach. It's not very well patronized going west. I'm not really sure why. I'm guessing it's probably because the schedule's not very convenient, since it goes west in the morning and east in the evening. I'm guessing that's just not convenient to use for going to Birmingham or back. The brief mention of the long distance trains that may or may not pass through Georgia in the next 15-ish years. Midwest to Florida train, New York to Fort Worth train via, well, basically the Crescents route, and then a New York to New Orleans route through Chattanooga, which would come down through Atlanta before heading down to, I think, Mobile is where it's going to go. Again, we're not kind of glazing over the long distance trains because this video is already going to be long enough. So a brief overview, what is a passenger train? I mean, we're talking more about the differences between commuter rail and intercity rail. Commuter rail is generally not branded as Amtrak, generally has one type of seat. Very rarely does it offer food service. Metro is adding in a bar car, or at least has piloted it. Some other railroads, commuter railroads specifically, do offer some very limited beverage services, like selling coffee and packaged coffee snacks. Bathroom situation. If you're on a Jersey Transit and they hate you, they only give you 1 per 8-car train. More normal services like Metro and other commuter rail services usually have 1 per car. Amtrak is different. It's usually branded as Amtrak. It's contracted with the state. In the case of Amtrak Midwest, multiple states. Usually there's 2 seating classes. There's obvious exceptions to that, the trains in California, except for the Surfliner, don't have a business class. The Piedmont up in North Carolina doesn't either. The Piedmont also doesn't have a cafe car, but most of them do. There's 4-ish routes that don't always have a cafe car or have very limited food service. Generally, each train has a bathroom in it. And the cafe car and business class are entirely based on the state and their contract and their willingness to pay for it, or at least possibly the viability of it over a given route. And we might talk about that in a future segment. Other differences is that commuter trains either run only at peak hours or kind of spread out through the day at 30-ish minute frequencies. Intercity trains run anywhere from once a day up to hourly. Intercity trains are also designed around longer trips with less frequent stops, and nearly all commuter rail routes in the US are under 100 miles. There's a few that get like a little over, like at like 107 or something, but like generally speaking, 100 miles is like the absolute maximum, and usually they're shorter than that. So the Department of Transportation defines commuting as a trip that is under 50 miles, which is why, generally speaking, commuter rail routes are under 100 miles. One-way trip to your primary work location. For example, and we'll get into this in its own little case study in its own little segment, Atlanta to Macon is 103 miles according to GDOT's rail studies, which would put it well beyond the range of commuting, even if people could use it for commuting services. Like even if people could use like an Amtrak train that has a commuter train closer into Atlanta. Generally, this is what seats are in a commuter train. This is a Caltrain commuter train, very basic seats. This generally seats in an intercity trains as an Amtrak service. I think in this is California. The airline style seat, airline style overhead luggage, um, tables. Picture of it inside of a cafe car on the California trains. You get your snacks here. You go sit in the booth. Condiment stand over here. So now we're going to get into the stillborn or possibly yet to be born Atlanta Hub routes, as talked about by Amtrak. So just some very brief notes on the next slides. As far as I've been able to find, there were no route-by-route budgets for the Amtrak 2035 plan that they released. The following is more or less what I back engineered based on how much the project was going to cost, how much they set aside for the Northeast Corridor, how much I'd guess would go into like equipment replacement, and then basically divided the last of whatever was left over basically by the states to the states per mile. This is more or less what I'm guessing they would have cost. And then there's also some other like base level funding I'm assuming that Amtrak would have given them. It's kind of a mess. It's not something I need to explain too much here, but we'll just say that that is like the base minimum cost of what I'm expecting, or at least what I'm expecting Amtrak to expect to spend on a lot of these. And then also putting in an upper end cost of Colorado's train for its phases 2 to 5, which I think is just phases 2 to 5. The cost I'm using, it might also include phase 1. I'm not really sure. It's not fully explained since this is a relatively new release as of time of making it. But basically, the phase 5 would bring all of the routes under consideration, or at least that were under consideration under 2035, to be about as frequent as Brightline services are in Florida, so about a dozen-ish a day. Also, the relative ridership was low. I calculated out what would 1% of the travel volume be based on rural Georgia highway volumes on the interstates, because the 2035 ridership estimates just undershoot all of that, and undershoot even based on like a decade ago rider like driving numbers. So it's just very underwhelming. This is the map on how I calculated all of that. So this is like the schematic map of what we could have done or what we can do with Amtrak in this state or into neighboring states. This is a map from the new Atlanta station video, just cleaned up and made to look a little nicer. Just a quick rundown on it. The blue colored lines would start in Doraville and then run south to downtown Atlanta and then spread out from there. The red colored lines would go from the Lakewood station near the airport up into downtown Atlanta and then spread out from there. Stations with the little black line next to them are the existing stations. Green lines are the stations Amtrak wants to add, or at least wanted to, and then the blue lines are just the ones that I would add in on top of this. So the Atlanta Charlotte route is like the big guy here. They wanted to run it 3 times a day. It'd be 5-hour run time, so it'd be about a 45 mile per hour all-in speed once you factor in all the stops. Would cost, I'm guessing, around $760-ish million based on their, at least what, like me reading between the lines and doing some basic figuring, and then up to $3 billion, assuming it costs as much as Colorado wanting to get a dozen trains a day on its route. Amtrak projected ridership somewhere between 2 and 300,000. It did as well as the Borealis. It could get up to 495,000. If it hit 1% of the traffic volume, it'd be 465,000. It's currently being studied under corridor ID. Other than some news outlets in South Carolina wanting to call it the Spartan route, haven't really seen too much in the reporting of it, at least compared to the train did in Savannah. I'm guessing because the Savannah train would be just a one-state route, it's a little bit it's easier to push through because I think North Carolina is leading the Atlanta routes, and they have other fish to fry, frankly. So expanding it, easier way to expand it to start would be to have 5 round trips a day. Um, 3 still requires 4 train sets. You could easily, well, not easily squeeze. You could, if you're reckless, squeeze 4 trains out of that. Um, Also, Amtrak wants to just do the online, like, Reddit pilled thing of like, let's just extend a bunch of existing trains somewhere rather than adding frequency. So, just for the sake of timekeeping and not screwing over North Carolina, it'd be better to have 3 round trips start just Atlanta to Charlotte, and then have 2 overlaying trains extending from Raleigh into Atlanta. So there's 5 rather than just 3 that are like extensions of longer trains. Because the reason being is that the North Carolina tracks are owned by the state. They can control the scheduling a little bit more. Atlanta to Charlotte is on Norfolk Southern, and I don't have faith in them, at least for the first couple of years, like not making the train late and having their trains extended to Georgia and Norfolk Southern not caring to keep them on time would basically just screw over North Carolina. So I don't really see why this would be a good idea for them. So having 5, and the bulk of it is just Atlanta to Charlotte, and just leaving that as like if they get screwed over, at least it's not going further into North Carolina, and throwing off more schedules is better, uh, transportation wise. So the Atlanta to Savannah route, 3 times a day, same as the Charlotte route. 5 hours 40 minutes front time, 291 miles, basically the same speed at 45 miles an hour, all in with stops included. About 620 million if we're doing the basic stuff, 3.3 billion if we get up to bright line levels. Amtrak's projected 100,000 riders a year. Did as well as the Borealis, 120,000. At 1% of rural Georgia's like traffic volume, 274,000. It's the one that's being studied the most under corridor ID. Has a very, very wavy route through Georgia, like the GDOT map, which there isn't even rails for this as near as I can tell. They want to run it from Atlanta to Athens, down to Milledgeville, um, back down to Macon, over to Augusta, down to Statesboro for the State University there, and then out to um, Savannah, which is, again, I don't think there's even tracks for all of those connections. So, future segment in this video will, or future video segment will go into the other options more. You need 6 train sets to maintain 3 trips a day just because of the length of it. If they wanted to run it like California does with the San Joaquin now Gold Runner, they could run the first trains early enough where it can become an evening train back, which, again, very close to the bleeding edge of equipment availability. You could very easily run into trains getting canceled because of the like train coming in being late, or having to like swap equipment really quickly. It would be a headache without any extra equipment, which a lot of the states are not very good at doing, ordering adequate amounts of equipment. Um, because the states aren't very good at doing that, I'm not really sure. I'm assuming Georgia would be any better than, let's say, like the Midwest or California is at buying adequate amounts of equipment to maintain a very, very tight schedule like this. So, yeah, 3 train sets can easily maintain 4 trains a day on this route, but again, you'd be running into the situation of if it's an hour late, that's going to be delaying the outbound trip to some extent, possibly more than is tolerable for travelers. So the Atlanta to Nashville route, 2 times a day, 6 hours, 35 minutes, 280 miles. I think this is like the slowest of them, except for maybe the Birmingham route. $700 million minimum, roughly 3.3 billion if we go all the way to bright line levels. 100,000 riders, 225,000 if it does as well as the Borealis. Based on the 1% rule, about 165,000. And other than adding a stop at the Chattanooga airport for people in like North Georgia to use it, not really too much of a change here from the like standard map. You would need 4 train sets to run 2 daily round trips, and like all the other routes, if you run the first train early enough, it could become an evening train back. But again, would be extremely unwise because first few years there's going to be a lot of delays as the railways get used to the new trains being there that run on a schedule that are it's like a very firm schedule. Um, so it would not be wise to try to do that early on, but it is possible to like get 3 train sets out of this, but it would be a very inconvenient early morning departure out of Atlanta and Nashville, and then a very inconvenient late night return to both their cities if they were to do it that way. Land in Montgomery 3 times a day, 3 hours, 20-minute runtime, 180 miles, 420-ish million to 2 billion, so 2 billion being the Brightline level. Amtrak projected at 100,000 riders, does as well as the Borealis, 225. 1% rule, 192,000. And again, other than adding in some extra stops, there's really not too much you can add on this. Same as the Birmingham route, we'll talk here in a second on the next slide. It's a relatively short, relatively quick route. You'd need 2 train sets for the 3-trip schedule. An extra train set or two could squeeze several extra round trips out of this route if you wanted it to. Birmingham route, 1 a day, would require 1 route, or 1 train set, 4-hour, 10-minute runtime, 164 miles. Very painfully slow considering it's not a very hilly route. At least not compared to like going up to Nashville. Costing the 340 million to get going, up to 1.9 billion if we did full Brightline. The thing about this one is it has like basically the same projected ridership as the Borealis, or as the previous route, the Montgomery route, although a bit lower due to the just it running fewer trains. And other than adding in like suburban Birmingham and then Douglasville as a stop, I mean, Douglasville I don't get considering it is fairly large and fairly close into Atlanta, but like not served by public transit all that well, at least into Atlanta, so I don't really get why that wouldn't have been a stop. Could very easily add to some of the like conspiracy theories about these plans that people get into, but I don't want to get into in this video. So if you threw 2 train sets onto this route, you can easily get up to 3 trains a day, especially if you decrease the runtime down to 3 hours, which is basically the length of time it takes to run the Capital Corridor route and the Piedmont route. In a same deal, third round trip or third set would get more round trips. The reason why you should add more service is because routes with similarly low potential, according to Amtrak, are getting more daily round trips. Like the Mardi Gras was projected to be as useful, and it got 2 at the outset. Birmingham route or the Montgomery route with the same like population along the way got 3. So it's very, very unusual for me at least. So why expand upon what Amtrak wants? Mostly just because Amtrak's leadership is absurdly unambitious when it comes to expansion proposals, and it does this to protect itself because it's better to shoot low and overperform than it is to like middlingly propose and middlingly perform. Like the Borealis and the Mardi Gras have way overperformed their ridership, and in some cases up to twice what was initially planned. Atlanta to Charlotte could easily go the same way, just because it's like 2 huge cities. Well, I mean Charlotte's not that huge, but it's still big. It would also be nice just to have Amtrak propose consistent levels of service on new routes rather than just kind of like throwing in service just to like hopefully get some political attention. So what are the benefits of running trains? Because obviously there's going to be the whole like, oh, it's environmentally friendly and all that stuff. Like we're not. I'm acknowledging that exists, but that's like not the like main selling point of these. At least if you're at least if you're not into like the environmentalism of this. So investment in your stations will generally generate 4x their revenue in private investments in the area, which is like renovation of buildings, constructing new buildings, opening of new businesses. New Hampshire saw this after the Downeaster opened. Utah saw this along the first segment of their commuter rail route, even during the Great Recession when they opened their commuter rail route, which I think was in 2009. They saw like 7x in just new apartments and new shops and like just building, not even like revenue of like people paying for stuff. Projected ridership on the Mardi Gras was 70 to 80,000. There were over 90,000 at the time I made this slide. Projected ridership on the Borealis was going to be about 300,000 a year with 3 daily round trips. They were hitting 225,000 with 1 daily round trip last time I checked in on them. So like rail is just underserved, and it also even if the trains themselves don't run a profit, which is kind of what people think Brightline is doing, is that like the train itself is not supposed to run profitably, but the investment around the station will more than generate enough tax revenue to pay for the investment and not cost of operating it. Okay, so now we're going to go into like the missing routes that at least the two missing routes before we get into like a different segment altogether that they should have added in. Obvious one being a 3 times daily Atlanta Augusta routes, starting in Doraville going to downtown and then splitting off to Avondale and Stone Mountain and then running out to Augusta. I guess this would cost in the $450 million range just to get going based on the cost of, again, existing Amtrak projects. Up to $2 billion if we went full Brightline, be a 3 hours, 50-ish minute runtime on 171 miles. And based on the 1% roll, you get about 365,000 riders a year. Columbus route, 3 times daily, 2 hours, 25 minutes runtime, 107 miles. My guess is it would be about 150 million to get going, maybe to 465. This one would be relatively low because I'm assuming you run it along the Montgomery route to Opelika and then just run back east. Because although there was a route directly from Atlanta to Columbus, it has since been abandoned, or at least not in use. So it would take a lot more to just reactivate it than just splitting it off for like 20 miles or however many miles it is from Opelika to Columbus. I haven't memorized that like distance in my head yet. It's not relatively short. And again, this is what like the schematic map would look like of stuff going in and out of Atlanta. And just brief summary of the expansions pod if you want to look at it. So the next step in all of this is who's going to run this, considering we do have limitations on what GDOT can run directly and other issues with like funding and whatnot. So the main way to do this would be to establish or reestablish or refund, or the history on this gets a little weird, the Georgia Passenger Rail Authority, um, which is effectively a state agency that would oversee and manage the services within Georgia, and its relationship with other states would be very similar to State Road Toll Authority or MARTA, because MARTA is also technically an authority. An authority is basically like a state-owned corporation that has like agency powers and also has taxing powers to some limited degree based on its legislation. So how we pay to keep it running and fund the services and build things. Using a hotel tax would be like the more effective way to do this, or at least expedient way. There was roughly $6 billion in hotel room revenue in 2012. 3% statewide tax would raise 180 million. The 2035 services would roughly cost 45 million annually in operating costs after ticket revenue, at least based on how much it costs around Amtrak Midwest. This would leave them a margin to have uh, connecting bus services to towns outside of the rail services, but also allow for some capital to be, some capital improvements to happen in between temporary tax measures, kind of like a local, kind of like a SPLOST, but it wouldn't be SPLOST because it wouldn't be local, it'd be statewide. Basically, they'd have to pass legislation to enable that, or at least enable this agency to do this. How would we pay for like the capital costs? So if we do a statewide equivalent of a SPLOST, it would be just doing a 5% room tax additional to the 3% would raise another 300 million. Quarter cent sales tax would be 501 million. About 850 million combined, which should pay for the low end estimate about 1.5 times over in a 6-year cycle. Granted, only about half that 3.3 billion total cost is needed in Georgia, or this would probably be applicable to us more directly than the neighboring states. But again, this is like an extremely doable ask. How would you run it? Have a 9-member board, 3 appointed by the governor, 5 elected from the PSC districts, 1 elected statewide. Also require them to have their own engineering staff, because MARTA's addiction to consultants is part of its problem, which I don't know if I'll ever make a video on that, but MARTA's got its problems. We'll go into a few here, but like or in this little series segments, whatever. Yeah, consultants and using consultants is part of their problem, and of the appointed board as well. Why we should have it be elected. So the total costs, including the 2 additional routes, would be 3.29 billion. This would be split between the 5 states. Uh, Again, the in-state portions would be split differently, or mostly be ours. If we do Colorado's phase 2 to 5, it would be 16.2 billion for Brightline level services on all routes. Thank you for listening. This has been a clip of a much longer video. The longer video is somewhere on the channel. And just thank you for listening to this shortened clip from a, again, much longer video. Sharing my thoughts. Just thank you. And Discord link somewhere, probably below me. Comments if you want to complain. And yeah. Anyway, just thank you for listening to what I gotta say.